Fellas, a few days ago, we released a video on a Titan build that we thought was amazing. And it was. We were making use of Sunder and Seismic Cry to absolutely obliterate bosses and clear waves of enemies. That build is still a wonderful build. It's easy to use. You could use it early on. Pretty much as soon as you unlock Sunder, you're good to go. But now that we're finished up with Cruel Difficulty and we're getting into things like World Tiers 4, 5, and 6 and higher, Endgame put a lot of pressure on me. And the major flaw of that build started to become apparent. While Sunder does a tremendous amount of damage, the wind-up time for it is very long. And this left us wide open to enemy attacks. So what essentially ended up happening was enemies got stronger, maps got harder, and I started to get shredded due to that long windup, which is why I decided something needed to change. Now, there's a few creators that have utilized a build like this. However, we've given it our own twists. And what actually ends up happening here is that we have the same lethality that we had previously with our Sunder build, but the survivability is substantially better. This is our Earthquake build. We've got a shield, we've got a two-handed mace that we're using in one hand, and the main component of this build is Earthquake. This creates jagged ground in the places that you smash, which slows down enemies, and after a short duration, this erupts in a powerful aftershock. Now, a lot of people look at this ability as just being a garbage ability. So many people were like, this is terrible. But think of this as your way of priming enemies. The support gems that we use on this fast forward the speed up of that aftershock eruption. We've got heavy swing for 35% more physical damage at the cost of -10 attack speed. And then lastly, we have magnified effect, which causes 40% more area of effect. Now we pair this with Infernal Cry, and this imbues our next two attacks with fire damage. This one's especially important because this is honestly one of the best ways to deal with enemies. Literally burns them out. And when we get into the tree in just a second, you'll see how many things are contributing here to our damage. Now for Infernal Cry, we have Premeditation for that 15% more damage for any skill empowered by Infernal Cry. So essentially 15% more damage for Earthquake. We have Life Tap, which converts the skill's mana cost to life costs, allowing us to spam it as much as possible. And the main loop here is to just cast Infernal Cry when you're surrounded by enemies and use Earthquake to hit them all and watch everything explode. Now to help aid us with even more kabloomies, we use Herald of Ash. This one's a really good one. It causes enemies to ignite if overkill damage is at least 20% of the enemy's maximum life. Now, by the way, overkill damage is any damage from a hit in excess of the enemy's remaining life when it is killed. Basically, this will be getting procced constantly when we are killing enemies, allowing us to clear very quickly. Now, one of the abilities I love to use with this is Leap Slam. This is great because in in-game, even after some of the sandbox changes, you can get boxed in. Leap Slam allows us to have that extra movement and is also fantastic when paired with Infernal Cry. Literally pop it, go for the leap slams. This wipes out big groups of enemies, and it serves as a tool of evasion. Now, the support gems on this are Holy Descent, Rage, and Aftershock. Now, Holy Descent is actually really nice because this allows me to get some health back when standing on the ground after doing that leap slam. Again, it's just on the area that you land, but it helps contribute to some extra survivability. Now, the last skill we make use of when dealing with mobs of enemies is Bone Shatter. This allows you to cause a heavy stun on enemies that are primed for stun. Now, you're gonna know an enemy is primed when you see this little circle over the top of their head. Matter of fact, any enemy that you see with that, you want to immediately go after. What this allows is for a shockwave around the target and pretty much clears everything. You pair this with Herald of Ash, and you're essentially looking at like dragonfly incandescent levels of explosions, which I think my D2 players completely understand. Now, this works so well because the initial slam of Earthquake immediately primes enemies, allowing for the quick follow-up with Bone Shatter. And anything that is still alive will get cleaned up by the aftershock from Earthquake. Now, the gems we have on Bone Shatter are Impact Shockwave, which creates an aftershock when dealing a heavy stun, dealing the same damage to enemies within 1.4 meters. We also have Heft for 30% more maximum physical damage, and Execute, which grants 40% more damage with hits against enemies that are low on life, which means 35% of its maximum life or less. Now, the last two skills I'm gonna go over quickly are Mace Strike, where we're rocking Overpower, Ruthless, Devastate, and Life Thief. Then we're also using Time of Need with Persistence, Vitality, and Precision. Now, those are the main components of this build. It is arguably the best build I have right now when it comes to mobbing enemies. I've even found myself putting it to the test, loading up with friends, and even with like World Tier 4s completely amped up, I'm still able to run around and solo just about everything. The only issue it has is its ability to deal with bosses. For the most part, I think Sunder is still better in that case. However, we have our ultimate ability, which pretty much takes care of any boss that we have trouble with. That being Hammer of the Gods. Fellas, this is my favorite ability in the game. It's literally a giant hammer that falls from the sky. Have you seen anything more tiny than that? We use this against bosses, rare enemies, anything that's chunky. It lands and it destroys. But the thing that we really lean into is kitting it out for bleed damage. That's because sometimes it doesn't kill everything that it hits, but the bleed damage will finish them off. We have Lacerate, which has a 30% chance to inflict bleeding. We have Deep Cuts for 75% more magnitude of bleeding at the cost of 25% less damage with hits. Then finally, we have Brutality for 35% more physical damage. Now, I do also plan on adding things like Fist of War, which adds ancestral boost to skills, which in this case would give us a 20% buff to our damage and our area of effect, which is perfect for Hammer of the Gods. Now, we use this in conjunction with Supercharged Slam, mainly for the Rupture. This essentially aggravates bleeding on heavily stunned enemies. We also have Bloodlust to deal 30% more physical damage against bleeding enemies. So you can see the loop here that we're going for, guys. You want to drop the hammer on beefy targets or a boss, then proceed to charge up your Supercharged Slam to deal chunky damage, and you'll see everything on the battlefield, including the boss, completely get ripped by this weapon. The only downside of this is getting your hammer to actually land. Bosses tend to move, which means you may be in a situation where you have to sit there and hold an enemy in place while your hammer makes contact. It has a fairly long cooldown too, so if you miss, you've got 24 seconds at base. So this really hurts your DPS, so try not to miss, guys. And I don't know if this is an intentional part in Path of Exile, but if you happen to move too fast or move too much or like dodge while you are calling down the Hammer of the Gods, this actually cancels out your ability and you literally don't even call down the hammer. So wait for that animation to follow all the way through. That way you don't cancel out literally your best weapon when it comes to dealing with bosses. Now with the skills out of the way, let's talk our passive tree. I'm not gonna spend too much time here. We could be here literally all day going over every little thing. You could just copy it if you want. I'm also happy to say we finally have a build link down below so you could see for yourself exactly what we're using for our tree. And as we go on and we update things even more, we'll make those updates for this as well. It shows everything, including our gems, our support gems. For my Destiny players, think of this as like Destiny Item Manager. Now something to note on the build link skill tree, any green branches you see are nodes that we're working towards. So if you are ahead of us, that's where we're trying to go. Now we're still on Titan, of course, but I actually respect to go straight for hulking form, for the bump to strength and the massive 50% increase effect of small passive skills. The most notable thing on the tree itself is definitely Giant's Blood. This allows you to wield two-handed maces or two-handed weapons in general in one hand, which is huge because now we can use a shield in our offhand for added defense. Guys, this right here is what makes this build so good for the endgame. It was a night and day difference in my survivability, going from holding a weapon with two hands versus one hand and a shield. The biggest downside to Giant's Blood, especially early on, is that it triples the attribute requirements of weapons. Meaning for the two-handed weapons, you're gonna need upwards of 400 strength just to wield them. Luckily, we're building around strength, so it's not a big problem build-wise, but something that will most likely take you a bit to get unless you get some insane gear early on. Now, speaking of gear, let's go over it. We're using the same mace as our last build, but the shield is what really matters here. You definitely want to try to get the highest block chance you can, as block actually has a chance to completely nullify damage that would have been dealt to you. Now, you'll still take any stun, freeze, or other debuffs from an attack, even if it is blocked. But this alongside the change that was made that allows blocking to work in a full 360 degrees around you is disgusting. And keep in mind, you don't have to actively be blocking in order to block, guys. This is passive. Just having the shield on has a chance to give you that nullifying damage. This is something you're gonna need in endgame, fellas, and it has made all the difference for us. As for my armor, it's all still pretty shite. As time goes on, we'll continue to update things on the link, but for my warrior mains, this build right here has been absolutely carrying. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.